Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk about how aphasia impacts music processing, if indeed it does. So people with aphasia suffer from language processing and/or production deficits. That is, they have trouble speaking, and they might also have trouble understanding people. It typically results from a stroke to typically language areas of the left hemisphere. It admits a wide range of subtypes associated with both the location of the stroke or where the stroke impacts in the brain, and also from the cognitive and behavioral deficits that manifest. Typically, speech-language pathologists divide the various aphasia subtypes into two categories, fluent and non-fluent. So in the fluent subtypes, people with aphasia, their speech flows quite easily, but the content can often lack meaning. So sometimes it can sound like gibberish to a neurotypical. In the non-fluent subtypes, speech is difficult or halting, and sometimes the words can be absent. So it's often true that non-fluent aphasia subtypes, those people suffer from agrammatism. So agrammatism refers to the difficulty with using and/or understanding basic grammar and syntax. It could also impact word order and sentence structure processing. So for example, people with Broca's aphasia often struggle to use function words like articles and prepositions. They'll really just stick to content words. They often struggle with grammatical inflections. So switching verb tenses, they'll just sort of use all verbs in the present, for example. And then they often can't put words in the right order. And this impacts not just production, but also processing. So they'll struggle sometimes to understand even basic sentence syntaxes, if you like. There we go. So I thought we'll do a little audience participation here. I'm going to give you an example of the kind of sentence processing that we do on an everyday basis, and then we'll think about how it impacts people with aphasia. So I'll give you a sentence context, and here it is. For the picnic, the chef baked an apple, and you give me a one-word continuation. What do you think should come next? I heard pie. Any others? Did I hear tart? No, just pie. Okay, well, pie would be the most probable continuation. And then there are a couple of others, right? And the last one should be the least probable. Yeah. So this is actually the kind of sentence paradigm that psycholinguists use in semantic priming studies, and also in syntactic or discourse priming studies. I'll talk about priming in a second. So what's going on when we do something like this? Well, one theory is about semantic processing, that there are semantic pointer words in the preceding context that facilitate or prime the processing of the target word. So if for the picnic, the chef baked an apple was heard, then the person might expect pie because of these pointer words. This means that in principle, the pointer words could appear in any order. So I've highlighted them there, right? Those are the words that might lead you to think of pie as being semantically related to them. But I could scramble those words and it shouldn't affect your semantic processing. I could give you that sentence in any order and you should still think pie, presumably. That's often what we call semantic processing. I'll refer to it broadly as contextual relatedness. How related is that target word to the preceding context in semantic space? So if you read any of the work in experimental psychology on priming, you'll read work on semantic priming fairly early on, and you'll see a lot of models that are based on this theory of spreading activation, which is a sort of zeroth order probability distribution, if you like, of all the words one might hear. And so the kinds of models that get used to model this theory are distributed models like ANNs or Word2Vec is a classic one now, that try to create a geometric space wherein words that are close together in the space are more semantically related, and words that are farther apart are semantically unrelated. We can contrast this form of processing for that sentence I gave you with syntactic processing. So in syntactic processing, theories that try to account for how we build the structure of the sentence as it unfolds often fall in sort of classic linguistics of the 60s and 70s, like generative grammars. And the kinds of experimental paradigms that get used are also sometimes priming, but they'll do a scrambling paradigm or they'll alter the sort of grammatical relation of a word in the context or the inflection of that word to try to trip the reader up. If you've ever heard of garden path sentences, those sorts of paradigms are used to try to show that the syntactic structure that the reader is interpreting or the listener is hearing will lead them to expect certain continuations grammatically or syntactically. So often we see models like parsers, context-free grammars, constituency trees, dependency trees, et cetera, to try to argue that maybe listeners are building a kind of mental representation like we see on the screen here with this tree. Well, what about people with aphasia? Where do the deficits lie? Well, we know that aphasia doesn't impair access to the lexical semantic network. That is that presumably they'll think of the words that are semantically related to one another, but it does impair integration of lexical semantic information into the context. In other words, when they try to build the mental representation of the sentence itself, they often struggle. Another point that gets made is that agrammatism can disrupt syntactic parsing, or what's sometimes called syntactic integration, so that you actually struggle to build this sort of tree where you realize this is a noun phrase and what follows a noun phrase is a verb phrase, et cetera. That kind of structure building doesn't necessarily happen in the same way for people with aphasia as it does for neurotypicals. Now, having said all that, I want to make a point about temporal structure in language, which is that what we've seen in the last 15 years of research is that this sort of this claim that word order is really crucial is not always the case across all the natural languages that we could study around the world. So for example, natural languages differ with respect to the order of sentence structure constituents, right? So you can have subject, verb, object languages like English, SVO. You could also have VSO languages or VOS languages, et cetera. We also know that they differ with respect to the flexibility of the order. So some languages are what we would call strict word order languages like English and German. But then there are free word order languages like Turkish and Basque, where they could structure the sentence in many different ways, and it would still be syntactically understandable between speakers. Finally, they differ with respect to the presence of syntactic markers, like case marking is really important in some languages. What this does is actually tell people between each other which word is what grammatical relation. This is a verb because of the suffix or because of the prefix, rather than because of its position in the sentence. Nevertheless, despite all those differences in what syntax really means, it's a very big term to talk about all the world's natural languages and their structure. We do know that canonical word orders, we see priming effects, in other words, semantic and syntactic priming effects, even in people that speak in free word order languages. So even in a free word order language, there are canonical word orders, canonical sentence structures that they learn, and that leads to these priming effects where they're faster to respond to the last word of a sentence if it's semantically or syntactically related to its preceding context. So now, how does this implicate music? Well, typically what's argued, or what has been argued for the last 5 decades or so, is that harmony in Western tonal music is very similar to natural language. It's often defined as an organizational system that governs the formation and succession of chords based on a referential pitch or tonic. It produces stylistically plausible, or if to use the linguistic term, well-formed sequences according to language-like principles. If you go to a music theory conference, you will hear the expression harmonic syntax all the time. And finally, it reflects a vast number of musical traditions, from Western art to popular and commercial. So it shouldn't surprise you that if you go into the music psych or the computational music theory literature, you find context-free grammars for tonal harmony, right? You get the kind of analogies between natural language to harmony all the time. And it shouldn't be surprising. This metaphor gets extended. It feels like in perpetuity. Like, how far could we suggest that harmony is like language? For example, harmony has a lexeme of constituents. We could think of chords as sort of like words, or maybe chord transitions as like words. And we see that if we look at a large corpus of tonal music of harmony, that we find Zipfian distributions. So just a few chords are far more frequent than the rest, right? We get these long tails, just like in natural language. We also see the presence of order effects in harmonic corpora. This is grammatical relations. In other words, tonal harmony, there's lots of theories of tonics that precede predominance, that precede dominance. There's pretonics in pop music and so on. This is sort of grammar that we're talking about. And finally, it's a bit hotly contested, but it's also a very old idea that tonal harmony is recursive. So you can see examples of nested relations. Just like you get a noun phrase within a noun phrase within a noun phrase, in recursive grammars, you can do the same thing for tonal harmony, a tonic phrase within a larger tonic phrase, and so on. So what behavioral evidence do we have to suggest that listeners are actually processing harmony the way they process natural language? Well, we know from the priming literature in harmony that participants are primed to expect tonally related target chords. That is, they are faster and more accurate when responding to some discrimination task if the target chord is tonally related. Notice here that the analogy is really to semantic priming. Just as we have a contextual relatedness idea where one word can be semantically related to another word in a space, we have the same thing for tonal relatedness, that two chords can be related because they're close together in a kind of tonal space. This means their order doesn't matter. And you get all this great work that's, again, 40, 50 years old. Krumm-Hensel's book from 1990, Krumm-Hensel and Kessler from 1982, where they create and they use models just straight out of the natural language processing literature. So you get self-organizing maps and artificial neural networks to look at the sort of structure of keys in the way that you could talk about it with semantic space for words. However, there's one behavioral study back in 2001 that looked at the order of chords. So now let's talk about the temporal structure of the phrase, or what I'll call temporal coherence. And what they found in that study, they just did a 2x2 paradigm. So it was tonal relatedness, it's tonally related or it's not to the preceding context. And then secondly, the chords have been scrambled or they have not. So once you hear a chord progression that's been scrambled, are you still just as fast to respond to a task about that target chord? And they argued, no, they didn't find any effects. They couldn't show that order mattered. So based on this, all these theories in music theory and music psychology about temporal structure and harmony, maybe the listeners aren't actually using any of that information when they're processing a chord sequence. Well, we ran a sort of kind of like a replication study, but what they did was they really just permuted the chords 2x2. So they'd take chord 1 and chord 2 and swap them, chord 4 and chord 3 and swap them. And they tried to do that for scrambling. But when we looked at the chord stimuli, we realized that a lot of the progressions were still functional. They still felt coherent. So instead, we built a computational model, or we didn't build one. We used a computational model for prediction of chords, trained it on a big corpus, and then built our stimuli and asked it, tell us which stimuli, when scrambled, are the least coherent, given what you found in this large corpus. And what we got back were really lovely priming effects from our participants. So there's high, medium, and low coherence. High is just chord sequences that you get straight out of a Bach chorale. And the low coherence is the most scrambled version of the sequence. I'm going to talk more about that with this follow-up study. And with neurotypicals, we found the staircase we would have predicted based on the model. That people got slower and slower to respond to the task when the sequence became more and more scrambled. Well, what about with people with aphasia? What kinds of studies have looked at whether people with aphasia have impaired processing of harmony? There are just a few studies that I'm aware of. The first study was by Ani Patel in 2008 and his colleagues. And they showed impaired processing of tonal harmony, which suggests, at least they argued, that the same areas of the brain responsible for processing syntax and language also process syntax and harmony, or in music. However, there have been two more recent studies by Bob Slevik et al. And Yasmin Faroki-Shah and her colleagues that showed, in fact, in some cases, they saw preserved processing of tonal harmony, which suggests that whatever we mean by syntax in music is not what we mean by syntax in natural language, that there are different areas of the brain that can deal with that structure, depending on the domain. So we thought, those previous studies all looked at tonal context. They weren't worrying about the temporal structure. They were just thinking, is this related to the key or not? So we thought, well, let's add in that factor and look at this temporal structure factor. So our questions were, does syntactic processing of tonal harmony in natural language implicate similar regions of the brain? This touches right on Ani Patel's shared syntactic integration resource hypothesis, the SSIRH. It's probably the dominant account for explaining or for arguing that natural language and music are syntactic and thus share resources in the brain for dealing with processing structure. Another way of asking this question is just, do language deficits engender music deficits? If you have language processing or production deficits, do we see similar deficits in your processing of harmony? And then the second question, how do tonal context, this sort of semantic relatedness idea, and temporal coherence, or the actual order of chords, how do these two things interact? Does order matter in people with aphasia? So in the study, we had 40 participants, 20 with aphasia, 14 were fluent, 6 were non-fluent. If we could have had 20 non-fluent, we would have done it happily. I'm in a town of 250,000. So with my colleague, Melinda Corwin, who's a speech language pathologist, 20 we were really thrilled to get. But yeah, in the Q&A, we can talk about power issues. We also used the Goldsmith Musical Sophistication Index as an inventory of their musical background, because we thought that might be have a big role to play. Maybe some people with aphasia that show strong priming effects, maybe they had a long background with music. Our materials we played sort of 48 9-chord progressions. You're going to hear one in a bit. And then they had various criteria, music theoretical criteria, to make sure that they ended well and that they were syntactically coherent based on a previous theory, et cetera. So we had two major manipulations: temporal coherence, either it's coherent or it's not, that's ordered or scrambled, and tonal relatedness. Did it end on the tonic in the key, or did it end within the key on a weaker chord? That would have been less expected. So here's the scrambling paradigm, just a simple visualization. We're going to leave chord 1 alone, leave chord 9, that's the target chord alone, but we're going to scramble those interior chords. How do we do it? Well, as I mentioned, we basically trained a finite context model, an n-gram model. It's called the Information Dynamics of Music Model, or IDIOM, by Marcus Pierce. It's really great if you haven't used it before. And it's because it's a finite context model, it just generates probability estimates for each given event in a sequence, given a preceding context. So we trained it on 3 corpora: the Bach chorales melody harmony corpus, the theme and variation encodings with Roman numerals, and the annotated Beethoven corpus. It's about 50,000 chords. It tried to learn the temporal structure of those corpora, and then we gave it the stimuli, which were those sequences of essentially Bach chorales that we'd slightly rewritten to follow a bunch of procedures, and then said, scramble them. We gave it every possible scrambled permutation of those sequences and said, pick the ones that are the most incoherent. Give me the one that was the hardest to predict given corpus cross entropy, or just average information content, if you like. By the way, the idiom is open source, so feel free to download it. I'm sure Marcus would appreciate it. So I'll play you 2 stems. Those are the 4 conditions, but I'll play you the one that's untouched, and then I'll play you the one where it's been scrambled as much as possible. And now the scrambled one. So our participants were asked to indicate as quickly as possible if the target chord was in or out of tune. That's our discrimination task. Where the fifth in the out of tune chords was flattened by between 1 and 150 cents. Because these were people with aphasia, the task like this could be very demanding. We intentionally used an adaptive staircase in the preceding block of trials to find what's their discrimination threshold for this task. We want to make sure it's optimally hard or easy for everyone. And we used that threshold in the out of tune condition for each participant. So it was kind of designed for each person's discrimination abilities. And then, they passed a hearing test and they completed questionnaires both about their music background and their aphasia diagnosis. And this was where my speech language pathologist, who's clinically trained, ran that half of the session. So our dependent variables were discrimination, bias, so signal detection theory variables. So how sensitive were they to the task, and how biased were they to respond one way or another. And then we looked at the reaction time data. That's really the priming effect. And then for our independent variables, we were looking at the group, if they're neurotypicals or they're people with aphasia, and then these 2 manipulations. Is it ordered or scrambled? Temporal coherence, coherent or incoherent? And tonal relatedness, is it related or not? And then we pre-registered the entire experiment on the open science framework and gave out all of our hypotheses, et cetera. So what did we find? First, I'll give you the model. So this is idiom trying to predict each chord in the sequence. So you can see here a huge coherence effect, right? This is what we asked the model to do, so this shouldn't be surprising. Once we started scrambling the sequences, it was generating probability estimates for every chord, and the most scrambled sequence was the one with the highest information content on average. And so we get a huge difference between the coherent condition of the stimulus and the incoherent condition of the stimulus. We get the exact same thing for the unrelated tonal condition. So this is the condition where everything is syntactically normal, but it ends on a slightly unstable chord, or a chord you wouldn't expect to be the ending chord. So you see here, there's no context effect for a model like idiom. It doesn't care about what key it's in. It just wants to know, can it predict each chord given the preceding context of chords? So it has no predictions about, is this last chord tonally related to the preceding context? Now, what did we find from our participants? So first, the people with aphasia, we get a really large main effect of temporal coherence. So they're much slower to respond to the chord sequence when we've scrambled it. And we also get a main effect of tonal context. They're aware of they could sense the key somehow, even though in the tonally related condition, it was all in one key. And the unrelated condition, the preceding context led you to expect that last chord would keep going, right? So what we found is they're clearly affected by the tonal context of the sequence, and then also by whether or not we scramble it. What about for our neurotypicals? exact same data, they're just faster at the task, right? So all of this data was transformed in the model to deal with, the various things we do transformations for. But it's back transformed for these plots. So you can sort of see it in our normal reaction time y-axis. But you can see they're significantly faster, but both main effects emerge and no interaction. So they're slower for a target chord if we've scrambled the preceding sequence and if that target chord is not tonic. Really quickly, just to look at the D prime data, we do get a sensitivity, or a temporal coherence effect for sensitivity. So participants were in the aphasia group were actually less sensitive to the task, ironically. They conflated the task with the manipulation. So they became less sensitive to saying, is that last chord in tune or not, if we scrambled it. And then finally, we actually get a stronger effect there for neurotypicals. We get that main effect and no effect of tonal context. And then finally, we looked at the bias data because in that preceding study I mentioned, we got really weird and beautiful bias effects. So we were interested to see that here. But we don't actually get any effects of bias here, really. What you're seeing is just a general session-wide bias to assume the final chord will be in tune. So all participants just sort of were biased to think it would be an in-tune chord, regardless of the manipulations. So to wrap up, what did we find? Well, I think we found evidence of distinct processing. Both groups showed significant effects of temporal coherence and contextual relatedness, indicating spared processing of musical structure despite impaired language processing in our fluent group and our non-fluent group. Another way of putting this is that it seems the integration of temporal and tonal contextual information may actually reflect distinct processing mechanisms. Now we're doing some follow-up steps. This is like really in medias res. We ran the study last summer and we've done most of the data analysis, but I'm writing up right now. So we want to do a mixed effects regression to look at, the Goldsmith and MSI, their WAB-R scores, the models estimates, and other models to see, what are the best predictors of our data. We want to look at the staircase data a little bit more carefully and make sure the staircase was working well for all of our participants. And then finally, we're currently running other studies where we try to generalize these sorts of priming effects to triadic chord progressions that are from other musical traditions like rock. Sometimes you can get non-Western triadic systems like Brazilian choro we're also interested in. So that's it. Those are my co-authors on the study that I mentioned. And if you have any questions beyond the Q&A, shoot me a line at that email. Otherwise, thank you very much.